It is such a pleasure, David, to welcome you tonight. And you need no introduction, but by way of welcome. David Loy is an incredibly prolific author. He has taught Buddhism, philosophy, ecology all over the world. I now and then go to your website because it's so rich, and I invite everyone to do that rather than taking more time. There's some, not only describing David's life and work, but some teaching video on there as well, so really nice. For us, maybe closest to the heart is that David started his own Zen practice in 1971 at a session, a retreat in Hawaii with Yamada Konroshi, Robert Aitken hosting, and then continued practice, koan training with Robert Aitken Roshi, with Kon Roshi. And I think I have this in mind that in 1984, David went to Japan and spent 4 years, I think. I got this off your website, but I love this detail. Intensive koan training with Yamada Konroshi there in Kamakura, and sat during this time side by side a lot with Ruben Habito Roshi. And at the end, became a Dharma heir of Kon Roshi with this beautiful name, Tetsu Un, Wisdom Cloud. So thank you so much, David, for your presence, your wisdom.
Yeah, it's great to be back with all of you, to see so many familiar faces and to also see lots of new ones. So thank you for this invitation. The ecological crisis is, it seems to me, the greatest crisis that humanity has ever faced, with the added irony that we're doing it to ourselves, right? It's not like the meteorite that apparently took out the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. They didn't have any choice. We do. Given the enormity of this challenge, we need all the help we can get. Henceforth, this question, what do our religious traditions, our spiritual traditions have to offer that can help us understand and respond appropriately? Hence, eco-dharma. The basic difficulty with eco-dharma and the other spiritual traditions is that they began a long time ago without any reference to this particular kind of problem, right? If you think about Buddhism, Buddhism originated in Iron Age India, very different time and place. And the Buddha, and in fact, all of the forms that Buddhism took in Asia are pre-modern. None of them was addressing the kind of situation that we're in now. There are, of course, implications of Buddhist teachings, and that's what we tend to focus on, sort of seeing how, in fact, what the Buddha and subsequent Buddhist teachers have emphasized, how that is relevant to our situation today. For example, the parallels between our individual spiritual predicament and our collective one today. That's one issue. And also, what I think is maybe the most important thing that the Buddhist traditions have to offer, which is the Bodhisattva path, or in this case, what we might call the eco-sattva path. But one thing that can be sort of very helpful as a baseline, even if Buddhism hasn't evolved or specifically responded up to this point to the ecological crisis, one question I think that's important to ask is, well, what does Buddhism have to say about the natural world, about nature? That would seem to be a very, simple and important question. Important for sure, but it's not simple, at least in the answer, right? Because unlike the case of, say, Christianity, in Christian Europe, we had about 1,000 years or more where you had a Vatican, you had a papacy that was kind of controlling the teachings. And so there was a kind of unification of what it meant to be a Christian for a very long time. And if you had different ideas than the papacy, you could get in a lot of trouble, and even to the point of being burned at the stake. Whereas what's interesting about Buddhism is that from the beginning, the Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and insubstantiality has meant that as Buddhism developed, as it spread to different cultures, different places, it didn't just impose itself, but it interacted with the local societies, the local cultures, and new types of Buddhism developed. So for example, our own tradition here, Zen Buddhism, it developed as Chan in China. The Buddha never really taught Zen or Chan, despite some of our koans. It's out of the interaction between Mahayana Buddhism and Taoism. And likewise in Tibet, when Tantric Buddhism went to Tibet, it encountered native Bon shamanism, and it was out of that interaction that Tibetan Buddhism developed. So what's fascinating about Buddhism is that there's no such simple thing. We have a lot of different Buddhist traditions which share a lot in common, but also they're significantly different in some ways. And the reason I'm emphasizing this is when we ask the question about the natural world, this is a really good example. That when we look at the Buddhist traditions, we find a variety of different answers. So let me just spend a little bit of time just sort of going through some of those views, different positions on the natural world. And not only the natural world, but remembering that we include in that our own bodies, right? Because our own physical bodies are part of the natural world. And one of the interesting things to notice, of course, is that the attitude toward nature, the natural world, is the way that that is coordinated with the attitude toward our own physical bodies. So here are some of the important questions to highlight at the beginning. Does devaluation of the physical world, which we find in some cases, does that correspond to devaluation of our physical bodies? And do we need to transcend them both? Is that the goal? And if so, what does it really mean? To anticipate what follows, can one transcend the natural world? Can one transcend our bodies? Or at least our usual experience of them, by becoming in some way one with them, non-dual with them. And if that doesn't make much sense, don't worry, I'll try to unpack that to some degree. So contemporary Buddhists are fond of emphasizing the ecological implications of Buddhist teachings, but for some people, these claims are quite controversial. Let me read a quotation from a scholar named Elverskog. On account of the Buddha's focus on transcending this world, it's understandable that his teachings don't focus on, much less romanticize, nature. Rather, early Buddhist texts are openly hostile toward the environment. In the Digha Nikaya, for example, Buddhists are told to generate a distaste for the world because it is impermanent. Since the ultimate aim of Buddhism is to transcend the world, it makes sense that not too much intellectual energy is to be spent on glorifying it. Or in other words, when the goal is nirvana, there's very little motivation for the preservation of nature, especially when nature is identified with samsara, right? this realm of suffering, craving, delusion. Continuing the quotation, one can search the early Buddhist canon in vain for anything that could be interpreted as appreciation of nature. If nature is ever employed in early Buddhist texts, it's almost always in terms of impermanence, decay, and as something to be avoided. Pretty strong, huh? Now here, Elverskog, as he acknowledges and emphasizes, he's talking about early Buddhism, right? Although even that claim, I think, must be clarified, qualified. And it's important to remember from the very beginning, we don't know for sure what the Buddha said, right? He didn't write anything. It was an oral tradition for at least 300, maybe as long as 450 years before things were written down. And we don't know what was lost. We don't know for sure what may have been added. It's very likely that the commentaries, it's like the monks would memorize the suttas and then not only recite them, but they would kind of help to explain them, right, to people listening. And over time, what would tend to happen is that their own explanations would tend to be incorporated in what they were presenting. So we don't know how the Buddhist teachings, as recorded in the Pali Canon, were changed in that process. We really don't know for sure what the Buddha himself taught. And in particular, there are some things in the Buddhist canon, in the Pali Canon, right, that suggest a more positive view of the natural world. One thing in particular that always stands out for me is there's a story that the Buddha had a dream one night where a tree spirit appeared to him and complained that one of the monks had cut down his tree and now it didn't have anywhere to live. And so, again, according to the story, in the next morning, the Buddha gathered all of the monastics around him and made a new rule that monks aren't allowed, monks or nuns, right, bhikkhu or bhikkhuni, they're not allowed to cut down trees or even cut off branches or even pluck a green leaf, a still living leaf from a bush. When we think about the Buddha's own life, he seems to have had a very special relationship with trees. The way when he went off on his spiritual journey, he went off into the forest, he meditated under the Bodhi tree, where he had his great awakening. Afterwards, he lived a lot under trees, taught under trees, he died between two trees. So all of that, to me, suggests maybe a bit more appreciation of the natural world than Elverskog is pointing at. Nonetheless, the way the Pali Canon has come down to us, he's largely correct, right? There are more passages in the Pali Canon that emphasize that the natural world is problematic, and it's not something that we should cherish. Instead, we're encouraged to become disenchanted with samsara and remindedness of the repulsiveness, as part of samsara, the repulsiveness of our own bodies that are full of piss and shit and phlegm and all those kinds of things, right? The point being to cultivate non-attachment to our own bodies as well as non-attachment to the bodies of other people as well. The Pali Suttas emphasize that our physical bodies, like nature generally, cannot provide the satisfaction that we seek. Both must be transcended to attain nibbana, the final goal that ends rebirth into this world. Whether or not this world is beautiful, it needs to be transcended. That seems to be the point of the Pali Canon. But what about other Buddhist traditions? A notable contrast, maybe the greatest contrast to this perspective, is found in a very influential Tibetan text, right? Shantideva's work, the Bodhicharyavatara, which celebrates the happiness of a solitary life in nature. Quote, "When shall I withdraw into the forest and live among the trees with birds and deer who say nothing unpleasant but are a joy to live with?" I like the way he puts it. There's some suggestion that living with the other monks isn't quite as much fun, right? They say nothing unpleasant. Huh? And there's another important, influential book, the 100,000 Songs of Milarepa, even more full of praise for the natural world. Let me just read a little bit. "This is a delightful place, a place of hills and forests. In the mountain meadows, flowers bloom, in the woods dance the swaying trees. For monkeys, it's a playground. Birds sing tunefully, bees fly and buzz, and from day until night, the rainbows come and go." This is lovely, isn't it? "In summer and winter falls the sweet rain, and mist and fog roll up in fall and spring. At such a pleasant place in solitude, I, Milarepa, happily abide, meditating upon the void illuminating mind." That's lovely. What about our stinking bodies, though? Full of piss and shit? Well, I think it's probably no coincidence that for Tibetan Buddhism too, it emphasizes something else about them, that the goal of tantric practices is not to escape our foul human bodies, but to transform them so that we experience them differently. Quote, as one of the Tantras says, "Without bodily form, how should there be bliss?" Bliss, lovely term, bliss in this body. Using mudras, mantras, and meditation, Mahasiddhas, that is to say the great adepts like Tilopa, Naropa, Milarepa, they're able to transmute their ordinary bodies into what are called Vajra bodies, right? Vajra variously translated as diamond or thunderbolt. And these Vajra bodies are believed to be just like the body of the Buddha. So much more positive attitude toward our bodies, or at least toward their potential, the possibilities. So you notice the contrast, please. In short, this more positive view in a different Buddhist tradition is a very strong contrast with the very much more negative view of the Theravada Pali Canon. And other Buddhist traditions offer different variations on this relationship. Some Mahayana texts go further and assert the non-duality of our bodies and the earth. According to one of the most important Mahayana sutras, the Avatamsaka, it says, "All lands are my body, and so are the Buddhas living there. Watch my pores," right? The pores of my skin, "and I will show you the Buddha's realm." This is very reminiscent of one of the greatest Chinese poets, Su Dongpo, from the Sung dynasty, very famous Buddhist as well, who wrote, "The roaring waterfall is the Buddha's golden mouth. The mountains in the distance are his pure, luminous body." Within Chan Zen, maybe the clearest expression of this kind of non-duality or identity is by, well, who else? 12th century Japanese Zen master Dogen, right? Quote, as he says somewhere in the Shobogenzo, "The entire world of the 10 directions is nothing but the true human body." This supplements a better known translation, or something else Dogen said, or actually quoted supposedly on his own awakening, right? And in this tradition, we know this quotation maybe too well, because our own progenitor, right, Yamada Koen Roshi, evidently this was the line that precipitated his own deep awakening. Dogen wrote, or actually, Dogen was quoting a Chinese Chan master, but this famous line, "I came to realize clearly that mind is nothing other than rivers and mountains and the great wide earth, the sun and the moon and the stars. Mind, maybe not a very adequate translation of what would have been what Kokoro or Shin, body-mind, I think, avoiding that strict distinction that we tend to make in English between the body and between the mind and the heart. In the Genjo Koan fascicle of the Shobogenzo, Dogen summarizes the process whereby we can realize that non-duality of self and world. Again, a quotation I think we're familiar with. Quote, "To study the Buddha Dharma is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by the many beings. When actualized by the many beings, your body and mind, as well as the bodies and minds of others, drop away." The idea of dropping away is an allusion to Dogen's experience in China, when he was practicing under the guidance of Chan Master Juqing, who during an evening meditation chided, reprimanded another monk sitting next to Dogen. "To practice Chan is to cast off body and mind," Juqing said. And upon hearing this, according to the story, Dogen was able to let go of his own, right? His own body fell away. His own body-mind fell away. And during a private interview afterwards, Juqing affirmed his realization. Body and mind is cast off, Shinjin Tatsuraku. When Dogen replied, "Don't grant the seal of transmission so easily," Juqing said, "Cast off, casting off." Please think for a minute what that means. The goal is not to cast off, transcend completely, get rid of our body-mind, but to then experience the body and mind, the cast-off body and mind. In other words, it's not about transcending body and mind completely, but to transform them, to have them transformed, to be experiencing them in a different way. And again, please remember the connection between transcending the natural world, transcending our bodies, the idea to go somewhere else, or transcending in the sense of experiencing them in a different way. The result is not a disembodied soul or consciousness, but a, quote, cast-off body-mind. As in Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet, the point of practice isn't to transcend them, but to transform them. Now this question, how do we really understand the difference between them, between the transcendence and the transforming? And here I'm reminded of what I have found to be a very pregnant remark of Joseph Campbell. I find it very helpful here. Every religion is true one way or another, true when understood metaphorically. But when it gets stuck in its own metaphors, when it interprets them as facts, then you're in trouble. The New Testament scholar John Dominic Crossan said it even more sharply. My point, once again, is not that those ancient people told literal stories and that we're now smart enough to take them symbolically, but that they told them symbolically, and we are now dumb enough to take them literally. What does that mean? What might that mean for the way we understand transcendence? Maybe transcendence is meant to be understood symbolically rather than literally. Crossan focuses on how the teachings of Jesus are often understood or misunderstood, but his comment highlights, I think, just as well, the tension between these two ways of understanding the Buddhist goal. Is the point to transcend this world of suffering by not being physically reborn? Or is it to transcend here and now, our usual way of experiencing the world, including our usual way of experiencing ourselves in the world. Dogen's account of his awakening offers a metaphorical understanding of the process of forgetting or letting go of oneself. The delusion of a self that's separate, that feels separate from the rest of the world. Perhaps there's nowhere else to go. Perhaps there's nothing else that needs to be attained. As the 18th century Japanese Zen master, again we know him well, Hakuin. When I was with Aitken Roshi and Yamada Roshi, we used to quote his Song of Zazen. Do you recite that one here too? What does it say at the end? Truly, is anything missing now? Nirvana is right here before our eyes. This very place is the lotus land, this very body, the Buddha. Let me say a few words here about Christianity, because I think there's a very interesting kind of parallel. Many of the earliest Christians expected Jesus Christ to return soon. In fact, according to one passage, he said that, let me not misquote it, I'll go back to my text here, right? Many of the earliest Christians expected him to return soon during their own lifetimes, where even those already departed who had died are going to be resurrected into this world, but a world transfigured. Again, world transfigured. According to the Lord's Prayer, Jesus called for the kingdom of God to appear here. What does it say? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, right? He predicted an apocalypse during the lifetime of his own generation, beginning with a period of great destruction and distress, right? Then he said, quote, then there will appear the sign of the Son of Man, that's Jesus, in heaven, and all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he'll send his angels with loud trumpet call, and they'll gather the elect and so forth. And so the last book of the Bible talks about this, right? Revelations. Talked about what was going to happen, except it didn't happen. So was it all a big misunderstanding? I want to show you the parallel here with what I was saying about Buddhism. According to Crossan, the predicted second coming of Christ was actually a late distortion of his teachings, because the kingdom of God, as he says elsewhere, wasn't an imminent end of the world, but a reality here and now, a realized eschatology for those who could perceive it. Once upon being asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God would come, Jesus said, the coming of the kingdom of God is not something that can be observed, nor will people say, here it is or there it is, because the kingdom of God is among you. Yeah? Already here. And the Gospel of Thomas, which never got included in the New Testament, it adds, quote, what you look forward to has already come, but you don't recognize it. The kingdom of the Father is spread out upon the earth and people don't see it. So it's interesting, when the last judgment didn't happen, then people projected it further into the future, although it seems to me that actually for most Christians right now, I don't know how many Christians really focus on, we're going to have this final resurrection. I do get the sense people often understand it more individually in terms of hoping to go to heaven after they die, or expecting a judgment pretty quickly rather than waiting for the grand return of everything. But what did Paul say? God is, quote, the one in whom we live and move and have our being, not after we die, but now. Now, why am I going into that? Because it seems to me there was a kind of a transcendentalization which shifted away from, hey, it's already right here and now. We're talking about a different way of experiencing this world, to something that's, going to happen in the future. And I just wonder, did something like that happen in Buddhism? There does seem to be some evidence when we read the Pali Canon that there was a gradual shift from the emphasis of what happened to the Buddha under the Bodhi tree, this full, complete nirvana, and then a gradual shift. Well, the really, really important thing was the parinirvana, when he actually died and then wasn't reborn, because he escaped this samsara, this physical world. In other words, that shift was a kind of a similar move away from experiencing this world in a different way to a kind of transcendentalization where we're going somewhere else, right? This tension between a more literal understanding of the Buddhist goal, transcending this world, and a more metaphorical understanding, transcending our usual way of experiencing it. It's interesting that this precise tension is actually reproduced in the Pure Land schools of East Asia. This is something we tend not to hear so much about, right? I think because it's basically much more devotional, and we have enough of that in Christianity. We're looking for something different in Zen. But in East Asia, by far the most popular type of Buddhism is the Pure Land. And there's an interesting difference between two different types, right? According to the Western direction Pure Land, teachings of the Chinese masters Tanduan, Daochuo, Shangdao, for them the Pure Land is another realm where one can be reborn if one has faith in Amida Buddha and engages in the right practices, right? And this approach, it tends to emphasize, if you read the text, it's great descriptions of how wonderful, how magnificent this Pure Land is as a way of arousing disciples' interest in wanting to go there. The idea of the Pure Land, it's not quite Nibbana, but it's such a great place, it's really easy to meditate and then attain nirvana from there. So that's the literal understanding. But there's another type of Pure Land, what's called the mind-only Pure Land, which claimed, well, guess what, guys? This world right here and now is in fact the Pure Land. Like that Hakuin quote. We perceive it as impure only because of our own impurities, which we project onto the world. The way to gain the Pure Land then is to purify our minds. And again, this is basically what we're talking about in what we're doing in our Zen practice, right? This emphasis on mind creates the Buddha, obviously very similar to Chan or Zen Buddhism, like in the Platform Sutra, the Sixth Patriarch, and so forth. Okay, let me cash this in a little bit. Keep in mind the tension between these two ways of understanding Buddhism, and this is a really important tension within the whole of the traditions, right? If the goal is to transcend this unsatisfactory world by qualifying for a better one, well, that tends to devalue nature, as Elverskog pointed out. The natural world may still be important, but it's only a means, an important means, but a means. Our ultimate destination is somewhere else. If, however, the goal is to experience this world, including our bodies, in a different way, in fact, to perceive their true nature, perhaps, then the well-being of the natural world becomes much more important in and of itself. And you could say, if our goal is to realize our non-duality with the world, that the whole earth is in fact our own body, as Dogen says, then obviously the health of its ecosystem should be a prominent concern, preeminent concern. What could be more important than healing our relationship with the biosphere, both physically and spiritually? Does this make sense? I just think it's really important for us as Buddhist practitioners to be aware of the tradition, to be aware of the tension within the tradition, and to be aware how at this particular point in human history, I think we've got to clarify for ourselves, well, which is it? What are we trying to do? Are we trying to escape the world? Or are we trying to realize its true nature? Does it make sense? But now let me shift gears a little bit. I want to conclude by talking about a particular image of the Buddha, the historical Buddha, Gautama, that I expect you've seen one time or other. It's called Bhumi Sparsha, right? See, the Buddha is sitting cross-legged, and he has his left hand in his lap, and with his right hand, he's touching the earth. Actually, he's touching his lotus. Usually he's touching the lotus seat that he's on, but we can say he's touching the earth, right? I think probably most of you have seen that at one time or other. This is the earth witness pose, commemorating the Buddha's victory over a challenge by the demon king Mara. And I've always found it really very suggestive, right? Touching the earth, what's going on there? What does it really mean? Well, according to the usual story, Mara first tried to intimidate Gautama with armies of demons and monsters, but when that didn't work, then he sent his daughters, right, to tempt the Buddha, but that didn't work. So finally, he challenges the Buddha's right to sit on that seat where he's going to get complete enlightenment, right? Mara said, well, actually, I'm the one who should sit here, and I've got all of these demon armies here to support me. You don't have the right to sit there. And according to the story, the Buddha doesn't have anyone there to support him, so he touches the earth as his witness. As the story is told, the earth is a witness that he's accumulated enough good karma over his many previous lifetimes that he deserves to be the one who sits in that seat. And when he does that, the earth roars, roar, supporting the Buddha's claim, and Mara disappears. Curious story. But what does it really mean? The first thing to realize is that this story actually isn't canonical. It's not a part of the official Pali Canon, the earliest teachings. It's something that developed fairly soon thereafter. I actually checked with Bhikkhu Bodhi. He's my sort of source for all of these early things. And he said, yeah, this is not canonical. And unfortunately for us, maybe, as far as he sees it, it doesn't have anything to do with eco-dharma, right? It's about, again, had the Buddha got enough good karma from his past lifetimes and the earth supports him, right? It's not, to quote Bhikkhu Bodhi, he says, I don't see it as confirming an explicitly ecological view of the Dharma. The Bodhisattva here is not advocating a particular line of earth-sustaining practices. The point is that the Bodhisattva's past deeds of merit qualify him for enlightenment. Which, again, that certainly accords with kind of popular views of karma. You know, karma is sort of merit that you can accumulate in your sort of heavenly bank account, something that I've never found very attractive as an explanation of what karma is really about. What I'm wondering is there another way to understand it? We can ignore it as trivial or dismiss it as maybe not very important. But given the situation we're in now, are there other options? And I want to end by kind of building on that a little bit. the light is getting dim, so I'm going to put maybe we have a... Great, thank you. The theologian Paul Nitter developed what he called a theology of correlation. What he meant by that is that the answers that a religion can offer should correspond to the questions that a culture is asking. Interesting. Say that again. The answers that a religion has to offer should correspond to the questions that the culture is asking. If it fails at doing this, then it becomes irrelevant. So the question for us, for Buddhism, right, for Eco-Dharma, is how might Buddhism respond to our situation today, this now global civilization that certainly seems to be self-destructing? Chomsky says we're living in the most dangerous time in human history. And it's no exaggeration, as I started out by saying, that the ecological crisis is the greatest ever. So, even if the gesture of the Buddha touching the earth, even if that hasn't been understood before as a kind of ecological gesture, remember it's not canonical. Is there here the possibility of a little bit of what is sometimes called creative theology in Christianity? And what do I mean by that? How might we reinterpret that story today to make it more relevant to us? When the Buddha touched the earth, the human body, composed of basic elements like oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and so forth, came into contact with a larger body composed of much the same elements, right? But that dualistic way of expressing the encounter overlooks the interdependence of the Earth's countless species, doesn't it, right? I mean, we learn in grade school, right? We breathe in the oxygen, breathe out the carbon dioxide, the plants take in the carbon dioxide, and, there's that interdependence. And likewise, with ecosystems in general, you have a bunch of different species that are dependent on each other. We know this. This is obvious, and of course it fits in really well with Buddhist emphasis on interdependence. Dogen was right. Doesn't that imply what he said, that the whole earth is our body? Really? Why do we think that the body ends here if the oxygen and, right? When we touch the earth, then we are caressing our own body. Arguably, one of the sources of the ecological crisis for us today has been religious focus on transcending the world by qualifying for somewhere better after we die. And I think a lot of that has to do with our fear of death as well, that, right? How wonderful to hear a story that says we don't really die, that we're going to go somewhere. We have the potential to go somewhere much better. What a big relief that is. Our English word nature actually derives from the Latin term natura and its participle natus, to be born, right? Nature is the realm where there's birth and death. Well, no wonder we don't like, no wonder we fear, no wonder we want to transcend nature, because we don't want to die. We don't want to be in the realm of birth and death. We want to transcend it. We want to attain immortality. Transcendence literally means to rise above. And it offers an alternative that addresses our fear of death. What a relief to be told that we don't really die. But at the terrible cost of enshrining a delusive dualism that denigrates and devalues this physical world and our own bodies, right? It seems to me that kind of escape is something that we can no longer afford, and one that our spiritual traditions really need to question. In other words, I wonder if we should replace these traditional religious preoccupations with rising above the natural world with a different metaphor, maybe even the opposite metaphor. What about the metaphor of descending back into the earth? Descending, reconnecting, in the sense of reconnecting with the earth. Returning, reconnecting to the generative mother of all life. This is also to settle back into one's body, to become fully embodied, to get in touch with and work through our repressed emotions and traumas, right? Does it make sense? And can we push the Bhumi Sparsha story even a little bit further to be more speculative? And maybe that's what's needed now. Can we say that it is the earth itself that wakes up when Gautama became enlightened? When any of us becomes enlightened? Is that why it roared when Gautama appealed to it? This would answer that old question about anada, no self, right? If there's no separate self, who is it or what is it that actually wakes up? I think that's a good question. I think that's an important question. Given what's now known about biology, DNA, and the evolution of all life from a single-celled universal ancestor, right? It doesn't seem that far-fetched to offer that kind of answer, in which case touching the earth can be understood as a really compelling, important symbol, metaphor for realizing our non-duality with the earth. What did Joseph Campbell say? Quote, "If you will think of ourselves as coming out of the earth, rather than having been thrown in here from somewhere else, you see that we are the earth. We are the consciousness of the earth. These are the eyes of the earth. And this is the voice of the earth." If Buddhism can be understood in this way, we're actually talking about something more than Buddhism, because we are returning, recuperating an ancient belief rooted in many indigenous traditions. An indigenous elder in Colombia named Alcibiades said, "We cannot speak of our relation to the land because we are the land. We are the land made human. They've tried to turn us into persons, but we've chosen to remain natural as part of the earth." And there's a lovely Navajo song. "It is lovely indeed, it is lovely indeed. I am the spirit within the earth. The feet of the earth are my feet. The legs of the earth are my legs. The bodily strength of the earth is my strength. The thoughts of the earth are my thoughts." Reminding me of something Dogen says somewhere, that the point of our practice isn't to get rid of thoughts, but to liberate them. The voice of the earth is my voice. The feather of the earth is my feather. All that belongs to the earth belongs to me. All that surrounds the earth surrounds me. I am the sacred words of the earth. It is lovely indeed. It is lovely indeed. If that's true, I think the implication is inescapable, right? To take care of the earth, its biosphere, its ecosystems, is to take care of ourselves. This non-dual perspective is consistent with a new emerging post-materialist paradigm, according to Ervin Laszlo, which he says is the traditional pre-modern one. He says, at the cutting edge of contemporary science, a remarkable insight is surfacing. The universe, with all things in it, is a quasi-living, coherent whole. All things in it are connected. A cosmos that's connected, coherent, and whole recalls an ancient notion that was present in the tradition of every civilization, that it is an enchanted cosmos. We are part of each other and of nature. We are a conscious part of the world, a being through which the cosmos comes to know itself. We are at home in the universe. To be at home in the universe, what might that feel like? Is that how we might understand the enlightenment that Buddhism talks about? One fascinating implication of this new old paradigm, maybe another bit of creative theology, is the possibility of understanding evolution in the broadest sense, right? The evolutionary process as the creative groping of a self-organizing cosmos that's becoming more self-aware. And here, of course, I'm referring to, for example, the universe story of Thomas Berry and Brian Swim, where they make the point more poetically. Quote, the mind that searches for contact with the Milky Way is the very mind of the Milky Way galaxy in search of its inner depths. I love that. You know, I think of going out maybe late some night in a dark place where you can see the Milky Way splayed out in the heavens. And you know, we do it and we wonder, like, what's it all about, right? Well, guess what? We, each of us, we're a product of that Milky Way. So when we're doing that, it's the Milky Way itself taking form as us, wondering what it's all about. Yeah? Berry concludes that humans can be defined as, quote, that being in whom the universe reflects on and celebrates itself in a special mode of conscious awareness. That's a bit wordy. We are the self-consciousness of the universe. But it's not about, again, it's not about transcending. It's something here and now, right? To awaken in that case would be to realize that I, right, am not inside my body, behind the ears, or looking out through my eyes in a world that's separate from me. Rather, I am what the whole universe, right? My big body, my true body, is doing right here and now, right? Each of us is one of the countless ways that the totality of its causes and conditions is manifesting. So, to come back to the very beginning, in light of the ecological crisis then, shouldn't what Berry and Swim and others have just said, shouldn't that become the goal of religion today? Shouldn't that become the goal of our spiritual practice today? To help us all realize that. And isn't that realization going to be necessary, something like that, if we're actually going to be able to really address the ecological crisis? Thank you.
chant the four great vows.
Let's do a Q&A.
Sure, sure.
And Scott, I think is that okay, David, for you?
It's fine, except as I often do, I talk too long. So but if you have time, I've got the time. So
Let's give it a try and see if
Okay.
there are just a few
Yeah.
questions. And then we'll end with our chant. Sorry.
Yes, David, thank you so much. I've been listening intently, and there are more questions than I could even bring up because of the richness of all the traditions that you talked about. But what came to my mind is, do we have to make such an opposition between transcendence and transformance? Can they not be seen as part of the same process?
the short answer is yes. I mean, I think we can understand transcending is that we have to transcend our usual way of experiencing. So I think we could still use the same word. I made a distinction there, but it doesn't have to be expressed in that fashion. Yeah, I would
Because I
agree
think
with
that
you
would
there.
be much richer of seeing it and less judgmental.
Thank you. Yeah. 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 Thank you for that.
Sir, thank you for a wonderful panoramic view of a wide variety of traditions, from the Tibetan Tantra of Milarepa to Dogen, and then ending with the native indigenous traditions and their views. And there's this vast wisdom that's been available to us. So my question is, how did we manage to get it so wrong? And so I'm reminded, also looking back at the Western tradition, and I'll just paraphrase a quote as best I can remember it from Genesis in the Old Testament. That God created man in his image, and then made woman, and then showed them the world and said, you have dominion over all the plants and animals, and go forth and multiply. So there's that example. And then, of course, as we get further into the Western tradition, which, the father of which is really Aristotle, one could say. And he, of course, with his immense analytical ability, really created, one could argue, a separation of the internal and external, and then that legacy has carried on for over 2,000 years, and now this heaven that we fail to see, technology promises that we can make it so much better. So where did we go wrong?
Well, thank you for that. I think to some extent you answered your own question. Genesis can be understood in different ways. As some of those quotes suggested, we can understand it more metaphorically. But the way I think it usually has been understood has introduced that kind of duality. As you said, we're the only ones created in the image of God. We're a special species, and we're given dominion. Well, some people might say we should understand it better as stewardship. But again, it does seem to rationalize, or if not justify, our ability to doing whatever we want to do with the rest of the other species. So I think that is one of the roots. Yes. The other issue, I think I alluded to it very briefly, is more literal understandings of transcendence, I think, are very attractive because of our fear of death. we like to be told, you know, you don't die or you don't have to die. And if you do what we tell you, you'll go to some place even better. And that gives a lot of institutional leverage or power, but it also addresses, you know, one of our, if not our deepest fear. So I think that's definitely part of it too. Yeah. I think one can go on and on, but maybe that's enough for the moment. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll be brief. Dogen does talk about being time, and I think that incorporates the connection with not just nature, but nature through time, and that we're all part of that.
Yeah, it's interesting, Dogen on Uji, right, being time. I like to talk about non-duality, but actually there's lots and lots of different types of non-dualities. And one of the more problematical ones is the duality between the sense of self that's in time, as if time is something objective and separate from us. And, you know, I think we experience that often. There's not enough time to do all the things that we want to do. And also awareness of our mortality means there can't be enough time. So, you know, that too is another way that we are encouraged to believe and to hope that death isn't the end. Yeah. Thank you.
So maybe we can draw this to a close and invite anybody with a burning question to hang around a minute. So,
Yeah, sure, for sure.
heartfelt thanks.